Yes,
So
now
this
it
is
is
the
visible.
first case
It's
of
visible.
70-year-old man with a 2 years history of progressive dyspnea. Here we can see reticular opacities associated with honeycombing predominantly in the lung bases, and there is traction bronchiectasis. This is a case of usual interstitial pneumonia pattern. Now, do we go back to the history? The history says it is a 70-year-old man. So here the age is very important. Considering age more than 60, and when we see a UIP pattern, the diagnosis is idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis unless proven otherwise. So, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis is a specific form of chronic progressive fibrosing interstitial pneumonia of unknown cause, which occurs primarily in older adults. Typically, the age is more than 60 years. It is limited to the lung, and the histopathologic pattern and the radiologic imaging pattern is that of UIP. So, I would like to emphasize here the pattern is UIP, whereas the diagnosis is IPF, or idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis is the diagnosis. The definition of IPF requires the exclusion of other forms of interstitial pneumonia, including other patterns of idiopathic interstitial pneumonias and ILDs which are associated with environmental exposure, or ILDs due to any medication or due to systemic diseases. Rarely, middle-aged adults between 40 to 60 years, especially with the risk of familial fibrosis, may manifest the same clinical scenario as that of a typical patient who is older than 60 years. And IPF in patients who are younger than 50 years is rare. So usually in less than 50 years, the diagnosis of IPF is not acceptable. We need to look for other causes. There is usually an underlying connective tissue disorder in such patients, which might be subclinical at the time when the IPF was diagnosed, and later the patient may present with the underlying connective tissue disorder. There are guidelines which were given by the American Thoracic Society and European Radiological Society, which these guidelines were revised in 2018. They categorize the radiological pattern into usual interstitial pneumonia, UIP pattern. Another is probable UIP pattern. The third is indeterminate for UIP, and the fourth category is alternate diagnosis. So in the UIP pattern, it is predominantly subpleural and basal predominance of the findings is seen. The predominant pattern is honeycombing with or without traction bronchiectasis or broncholectasis. So I would like to emphasize here that honeycombing is a very important feature, and once honeycombing is seen and the age is more than 60 years, the diagnosis of UIP and IPF is by far the most common diagnosis. The next pattern is probable UIP. Here it is subpleural and basal predominance is seen, but the reticular pattern is associated with traction bronchiectasis or broncholectasis, and honeycombing is not seen. So that is the differentiating feature between probable UIP and UIP. The third category is indeterminate for UIP. Here again, the distribution is subpleural and basal predominant, which we are seeing in all the three categories. But here, the CT findings of the lung fibrosis of the reticular pattern, they do not suggest any specific etiology. It is truly an indeterminate, which we cannot categorize only on the basis of CT scan. And here is the category where multidisciplinary approach plays a very important role. The fourth is alternate diagnosis, which means the findings are suggestive of any other diagnosis. If we are seeing cysts in the scan, if we are seeing mosaic attenuation, if there is predominance of ground glass, or if there is predominance of nodules, then it does not suggest a UIP or a probable UIP pattern. It represents any alternate diagnosis. So let us see an example of each pattern. This is a UIP pattern. Here we can see subpleural and basal predominance of the fibrosis and honeycombing is seen. There is traction bronchiectasis. So this is a clear-cut a case of usual interstitial pneumonia pattern. This is an example of probable UIP. Here again, subpleural and basal predominance is seen. We can see reticular opacities as evidenced by these linear reticular opacities. We can see peripheral traction bronchiectasis and broncholectasis as seen here, but honeycombing is not seen. And to see the honeycombing, it is always advisable to take prone imaging. So I would like to emphasize that for a good HRCT, we should always take a good inspiratory image a good expiratory as well as a prone scan, because honeycombing in the lung basis is usually best appreciated on the prone scan. The third is indeterminate for UIP. Here, the CT findings of the lung fibrosis do not suggest any specific etiology. It is truly indeterminate. Here, we can see some reticular opacities in the lung basis, but there is no traction bronchiectasis, there is no honeycombing. We cannot label it as a UIP or a probable UIP pattern. And there are no other features such as cysts, nodules, or mosaic attenuation. So it comes into the third bucket of indeterminate for UIP. And here is the scan where multidisciplinary approach is very important. The fourth category is alternate diagnosis. Here, other features such as cysts, mosaic attenuation, predominant ground glass opacities, or centrilobular nodules, or a peribronchovascular predominant distribution of fibrosis is seen. So here the case on the left is that of chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis. Here we can see mosaic attenuation, which shows areas of ground glass opacities, areas of air trapping, and normal lung. We can see reticular opacities as well. So this is a case of chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis. The image on the right shows a case of chronic pulmonary sarcoidosis. As we can see, peribronchovascular nodules are seen. Fibrosis is evident in the form of traction bronchiectasis, and due to the presence of nodularity, this is a case of chronic pulmonary sarcoidosis. It falls in the fourth category of alternate diagnosis. So what is the clinical implication of giving these categories of UIP, probable UIP, indeterminate, and alternate diagnosis? Because for it is to decide which patient needs to go for a bronchoalveolar lavage or a surgical lung biopsy or a transbronchial lung biopsy or a cryobiopsy. So for any patient with newly detected ILD of apparently unknown cause who are clinically suspected of having IPF, if the HRCT pattern shows a UIP, if it is a typical UIP showing honeycombing with basal predominance, then none of the above is recommended. It is a clear-cut case of UIP, IPF, and you can go ahead with the diagnosis if the HRCT pattern is suggesting a UIP pattern. However, if it is the suggesting a probable UIP, indeterminate, or it suggests any alternate diagnosis, then bronchoalveolar lavage and surgical lung biopsy is suggested. However, the ATS-CRS guidelines have no recommendations for transbronchial lung biopsy or a lung cryobiopsy. So let's move on to the next case. This is a case of a 23-year-old male who presented with cough and breathlessness since 5 days. Here we can see we have two scans. First is of December and the second is after 1 month. This is a follow-up scan after treatment. When the patient had presented, we can see multiple ill-defined centrilobular nodules which are diffusely distributed throughout the lungs. There is no zonal distribution pattern. There is no central or peripheral dominance. It is diffuse. Whereas in the next follow-up scan after treatment, these nodules have significantly regressed. So what is the diagnosis? This was a case of tropical pulmonary eosinophilia. So tropical pulmonary eosinophilia is predominantly seen in the Indian subcontinent and other tropical countries, and its etiological link with W. bancrofti and Brugia melli is well established. It is basically a hypersensitivity response to microfilaria, and it is very common to see it in our country. The patients usually present with cough and fever of a short duration. The diagnosis is confirmed by donor criteria. It includes the patient should be a resident of tropics. The absolute eosinophil count is more than 30,000 microliter. Serum immunoglobulin level is more than 1,000 international unit. There are elevated titers of antifilaria antibody. There is absence of peripheral blood microfilaria, and once the patient is treated with diethyl carbamazine and a follow-up imaging or a follow-up blood investigation is done, there is response to DEC. So tropical pulmonary eosinophilia, it can be conclusively diagnosed in a CT scan with a high index of clinical suspicion and in patients in whom the serum IgE levels are supporting the findings. So we can order a CT scan in patients in whom we are suspecting tropical pulmonary eosinophilia. There are definitely positive results. The most common patterns of pulmonary involvement, we can see ill-defined bronchocentric nodules, which are diffusely scattered in both the lungs without any zonal predominance. These nodules may form confluent bronchocentric ground glass opacities. There can be mild bronchial prominence in both lungs. In some severe cases, smooth interlobular septal thickening is seen, and pleural effusion is also known to occur. This CT scan findings of tropical pulmonary eosinophilia needs to be differentiated from other causes of bronchocentric nodules. And these causes may be acute inflammatory hypersensitivity pneumonitis, inflammatory bronchiolitis, respiratory bronchiolitis, or other causes of infectious bronchiolitis, because the treatment for all of them is different. So here, let us see two cases. The case on the left is that of tropical pulmonary eosinophilia. As we can see, the nodules here are more denser and they are more discrete, whereas the case on the right is that of acute inflammatory hypersensitivity pneumonitis. Here the nodules are more ill-defined and they are more confluent. Here we are seeing very ground glassy sort of nodules, which are more confluent, more ill-defined, and hardly we are seeing any normal lung parenchyma in between. Whereas in tropical pulmonary eosinophilia, we can appreciate the nodules as well as the surrounding normal lung parenchyma. Let us review the other differential diagnosis. Now here, the first one is the case of tropical pulmonary eosinophilia. As I previously mentioned, the nodules here are very denser, discrete, with normal lung parenchyma seen in between. The next case is that of respiratory bronchiolitis. Here also we can see very discrete nodules, but respiratory bronchiolitis is seen in smokers. So this is where the history also plays a very important role for us, because we need to know the clinical background of the patient with the blood investigations as well as the clinical history. The third is a case of infectious bronchiolitis. Here we can see these branching pattern of nodules, and this is most commonly seen in tuberculosis. And the fourth is a case of inflammatory bronchiolitis. This is a very non-specific condition. We see it in many patients, and usually a follow-up scan after 7 days, if we see these nodules are resolved. So these were the differentials of very discrete central lobular nodules which we come across in our day-to-day practice. And any patient presenting with cough and fever, we are usually seeing such patterns. So this we had done a study in patients with clinically proven tropical pulmonary eosinophilia with follow-ups, and in most of the patients we found that there was a very good response to diethyl carbamazine, and follow-up scan after 3 weeks, usually the nodules had disappeared or they had regressed significantly. So now coming to the third case, a 34-year-old man presented with acute breathlessness since 2 days. Here we can see CT scan of the chest. This is the mediastinal window and this is the lung window. In the mediastinal window, there is peripheral wedge-shaped consolidation and there is bubbly lucencies within the consolidation. This we are appreciating on the mediastinal window. We can see the bubbly lucencies better. Whereas on the HRCT window, the same area of consolidation shows a ground glass halo. So whenever we come across such a picture of consolidation, what is the next investigation that we should order? We should go for a pulmonary angiogram. And when the pulmonary angiogram was done in the same patient, we found a pulmonary infarct. We found this embolism, and this was a case of pulmonary infarct. So this basically pulmonary infarcts in the lung, they present as wedge-shaped areas of juxtapleural opacification, and the consolidation presents with internal air lucencies, which is we call that as bubbly consolidation. This basically represents the non-infarcted aerated lung parenchyma, which is coexisting side by side with the infarcted lung in the same lobule. And this is due to the dual supply by the bronchial artery and pulmonary artery. When there is a thromboembolism in the pulmonary artery, the spared lung, which is supplied by bronchial artery, shows normal aeration. And on the HRCT window, we see these convex borders which show a halo sign. This is due to the adjacent hemorrhage. So we need to carefully look at the mediastinal window, and wherever we are suspecting these bubbly lucencies, we should always order for a pulmonary angiogram. And there might be an infarct in one of the segmental, there might be, thrombus in one of the segmental branches. So a CT pulmonary angiogram, here the image shows filling defects within the pulmonary vasculature. When the artery is viewed in the axial plane, here there is a central filling defect from the thrombus, which is surrounded by a thin rim of contrast. And this radiologically, we call it as a polo mint sign. This is the same thrombus which we are seeing in the long axis in the sagittal image. So moving on to the next case. This is a case of a 34-year-old male presented with headache since 2 months, a patient with long-standing headache, MRI of the brain, various sequences are there. So this is a T2 image. We are seeing a lesion in the left ventricle, which is attached to septum pellucidum. ADC shows restriction of diffusion. A restriction of diffusion in a lesion means it is a very highly packed, a very highly cellular lesion. So on T1 weighted images, this lesion appears as dark, and on post contrast, it shows very mild post contrast enhancement. So this is the case of central neurocytoma. Central neurocitomas are WHO grade 2 neuroepithelial intraventricular tumors, and they are usually seen within the lateral ventricles. They are typically attached to septum pellucidum, usually presenting in young patients between the age of 20 to 40 years. The patient presents with symptoms of increased intracranial pressure, and headache is the most common feature. Rarely, patient may present with seizures, especially when the tumor shows extraventricular extension. So these tumors generally have a very good prognosis provided a complete resection can be achieved. So here again, imaging plays a very important role. The imaging features of a central neurocytoma, the tumor shows calcification in over half of the cases, and it is usually punctate in nature. There might be cystic areas, and cystic areas are frequently present in the larger tumors. Contrast enhancement is usually mild to moderate, and there is an accompanying ventricular dilatation often present, which may be the cause of headache in these patients. Moving on to the next case, a 30-year-old male presented with headache since 15 days and episodes of convulsions. Here again, MRI of the brain with post-contrast images are given. Here we appreciate a cystic lesion with a hypo-intense dot. This is a cyst with a dot sign. We are appreciating this dot on FLAIR images. Here the lesion is intraventricular. Here you can appreciate the small dot. On post contrast, this dot enhances the periphery of the cyst enhances here in the intraventricular the lesion. The dot enhances the periphery of the cyst is enhancing. So this is a case of neurocysticercosis. So neurocysticercosis, these might be intraventricular or subarachnoid in location. As we can see here, it is an intraventricular neurocysticercoma, and usually it is associated with ventriculitis, which often leads to aqueductal stenosis and hydrocephalus. Or they can also be parenchymal, and the cysts are usually seen at the junction of gray-white matter. So here we can see a parenchymal neurocysticercoma, which is showing a scolex, which shows enhancement. So stages of neurocysticercosis, there are 4 stages, and radiologically we can identify the stage. The first is the vesicular stage, which shows the classical cyst with a dot sign. Here we can appreciate in the image there is a cyst, inside the cyst there is a dot. There is usually no enhancement, although very faint enhancement of the wall, as well as the enhancement of the scolex may be seen. And in the first stage, that is this vesicular stage, there is no surrounding vasogenic edema. The next is the colloidal vesicular stage. The cyst becomes more turbid. So the fluid in the cyst is more well appreciated on T1 weighted images. It appears as hyperintense. There is mild surrounding edema which starts developing. The cyst and the wall becomes thickened and they start showing bright enhancement. And the scolex, which is the central dot within the cyst in the early colloid phase, it is seen, but it gradually shrinks down. The next is the granular nodular stage, in which the edema decreases, the cyst wall retracts, and eventually becomes a small enhancing nodule. And the enhancement persists, but it is less marked than that in the previous stages. So this is somewhere in between colloid vesicular and granular nodular, where we can appreciate the edema and there is mild enhancement. However, we are not able to appreciate the scolex because it shrinks down and it does not show enhancement. The next is the nodular calcified stage. It is the end stage. We can appreciate a calcified nodule here. The edema has resolved and there is a signal dropout on T2 and T2 star, that is the GRE sequences. It appears as a hypointense lesion, and on CT scan we can appreciate a calcified nodule. So we need to differentiate neurocysticercosis from tuberculomas, because both in the brain appear as ring enhancing small lesions. So neurocysticercosis, these are usually smaller in size. The lesions are often less than 20 millimeters, and they might be single or multiple, whereas tuberculomas are usually larger, and tuberculomas may present as conglomerated lesions, and they are usually multiple in numbers. Then associated meningitis is absent in neurocysticercosis. However, it is usually seen with tuberculoma. Patient usually presents with TB meningitis. That is usually the first presenting symptom. Whereas in neurocysticercosis, meningitis is not there. Patient presents with headache due to aqueductal stenosis and ventriculitis. The location of neurocysticercosis is usually seen at gray-white matter junction, or it might be intraventricular as well, whereas tuberculoma is commonly seen in white matter, and it is more commonly seen in the posterior fossa. When we go on to imaging, the T2 weighted images are important. These have the differentiating features. The cyst is seen as a hyperintense lesion, and the scolex is a hypointense dot which is seen within the cyst. Whereas in tuberculoma, the lesions are seen as hypointense on T2 weighted images. So if we see the two side by side, this is a cyst with a hypointense scolex appreciated on T2 weighted images. The same on FLAIR will show signal DOP, but the scolex is identified. And on post contrast images, the scolex enhances. Whereas a tuberculoma on a T2 weighted images appears as hypointense. On FLAIR also it will appear as hypointense. And on a post contrast study, it will show peripheral enhancement, whereas there is no inside enhancing scolex. So this is the differentiation between neurocysticercosis and tuberculoma. Both look very alike, but imaging plays a very important role here to differentiate the two conditions. So that is all. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bhumi, for an excellent presentation. I think there are questions to be answered, and I am just inviting my fellow chairperson, Dr. Indranil Sinha Roy, who is there online. So, Dr. Indranil, will you, and whether there is any question for Dr. Bhumi? Dr. Pal, can you help if there is any question?
Dr. Professor Nandini, your any comment?
As such, this is a very beautiful presentation, and we saw a number of nice clinical images. I don't have any question, but I am sure that the audience has benefited from your lecture, Dr. Bhumi. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Those
Dr.
who
Bhumi
read,
and the organizer.
Thank you, sir.
thank you.